Thank you for listening to me in English. I don't know whether you had much choice in the matter, because if the lecture had been in German, then this would have been it. A long period of silence. You may, at the end of the lecture, feel that you would have preferred it in German. But I will do my best from the English context to convey some of the work that we have been doing. Thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today to share with you work which my colleague, Molly Warrington, and I have been involved in over the last decade, looking at work associated with underachieving boys, but also remembering that we're trying to construct this within an inclusive agenda, not forgetting girls. Because I think from within the United Kingdom, the debate over the last 15 years or so has threatened to make girls invisible, has threatened to make girls disappear from the agenda, and that is certainly something that we don't want to help to exacerbate. What I want to try and do in my presentation is to focus on 6 themes, really, that I've described here, to look at how single-sex teaching has evolved, to look at recent research and potential benefits, to look at perspectives from our own Raising Boys Achievement perspective and project, and then to think about preconditions for success. Finally, to have some cautionary words. Is single-sex teaching another false dawn in terms of trying to raise achievement, motivation, engagement for boys? In the United Kingdom, there has been a long tradition of single-sex schooling. Many privately funded independent schools were established within this context, and many state schools also were developed along a single-sex basis, generally speaking, accessing education for the more affluent children within our society. So inevitably, there was within that high achievement levels. Such schools regularly top our pseudo-scientific league tables, but it's almost entirely due to their intake and the aspirations of the parents. But over the period since we developed a comprehensive pattern of education rather than a tripartite pattern of education, the number of single-sex schools has decreased quite dramatically over the last 20 years, falling, in fact, by some 80%. And about 50% of our independent, non-state schools are now coeducational. So on the one hand, we have got a decline in single-sex schools per se. Against that, however, we have a resurgence of interest in single-sex teaching for girls. Most markedly, this has been not only in the United Kingdom, but in Australia and more recently in the United States, focusing upon trying to create equal opportunities for girls, bearing in mind that in the UK particularly, we still have traditionally gendered career paths for many girls, and indeed an income disparity and an opportunity disparity for girls and for women within our own society. So single-sex schooling, on the one hand, began to develop in the context of increasing opportunity for girls. At the same time, however, over the period 1970 to 1995, there was very little development of single-sex classes, mono-educational classes within mixed schools. There was an ideological resistance amongst many teachers to the notion that comprehensive schools in our context should be anything apart from coeducational. So, although you may have schools, single-sex classes for sex education, because in the UK you can't have boys and girls talking to each other about sex, and certainly games and physical education tended to be in single-sex classes, there was very little other development of single-sex classes until about 1995, when educators began to get interested in the notion that perhaps boys would benefit, as well as girls, from single-sex education, from being in single-sex classes in coeducational schools. And inevitably, from 1995 onwards then, there has been a grappling with this issue, trying to see the extent to which boys, and in inverted commas girls, would benefit from being taught separately. And it's a sharp reminder, I think, of the extent to which the discourse about gender in the United Kingdom, in Australia, and in the United States has been dominated by an obsession about boys. You remember I started by saying concern with girls has almost disappeared from the agenda in the UK in this period 1995 to 2005. So the discourse has been captured by this panic about boys' underachievement. Against that, however, we have very little tangible evidence about the impact of single-sex classes in mixed comprehensive schools on achievement and on motivation of both girls and of boys. Some of the earlier work was conducted by the National Foundation for Educational Research from 2000 onwards, and I have tried to summarize some of the early research evidence which began to emerge at the beginning of this century about boys' achievement and about teachers' perceived advantages of single-sex classes for boys. I've tried to summarize them there. The opportunity to use a variety of teaching strategies which were apparently targeted to boys' needs and boys' interests. The feeling that in an all-male environment, boys would learn with fewer distractions. That single-sex classes provided a context in which teachers could challenge boys' stereotypes more effectively. But it is interesting even here that in this research there emerges an unease, a worry, that the whole focus is on constructing an environment for boys. And the notion began to gain credence that girls would learn whatever, that girls were more malleable, that girls were more compliant, that girls were more cooperative, that girls needed less challenging teaching. So some schools were even beginning to try to identify who they felt were good teachers, the better teachers, and to direct them to some of the more challenging boys' classes. And it was certainly an argument that Molly Warrington and I found difficult to dispel, difficult to challenge in the early years of our research. It's fascinating in passing to mention that in all the research I've been involved in, I've worked largely with groups of women academics. So if I've ever made the mistake of trying to concentrate on boys, I've been sharply and quite correctly brought to rebuke. So we began in our work from 2002 onwards, we began to focus on particular schools, on schools that had established single-sex classing for a long time, where there was a track record of development. And we began to identify from those schools factors which appeared to contribute to the high achievement level of both girls and boys, helping boys to achieve without disadvantaging girls. And I've summarized some of the points here. The third point is particularly important. In some of our schools, we felt that many girls felt extremely comfortable within single-sex classes. They displayed amazingly high levels of confidence and maturity. At the same time, the boys felt that the single-sex classes were safer places for learning, were more constructive places for learning. And indeed, we began to get boys talking to us. I don't know how articulate German boys are, but English boys, if you get beyond 2 or 3 grunts, you're really into a conversation with them. So you're doing really well at that level. There was emerging evidence then from a few schools that there was potential in this approach. But we wanted to see how far our own experience was being replicated. So we did a semi-national study in the years in 2002 of what had been happening in the last 7 years. The results were not at all encouraging. I've tried to summarize some of the conclusions here. This is based upon a survey of around 30 to 40 state schools. There was no pattern in terms of which subjects single-sex classes were being introduced, or how long the experiment was being introduced for. It was clear that some schools were introducing single-sex classes in an ad hoc way, for short time periods, with little preparation. Some schools believed it had raised achievement levels, others felt it didn't. Some had seen behavior worsen, others had seen it improved. In some schools, girls were blossoming away from the distraction of boys, and the implicit need in some classes of girls to support boys in their learning. And in other schools, the experiment seemed to be coming to fruition. So there was a great deal of uncertainty. But the last point on my slide is important, that there were a few schools where very good practice was in place. But the review exacerbated our unease in England about the extent to which single-sex classes were contributing to a discourse that was related only really to boys. It wasn't related to a discourse that was related both to boys and to girls. There was a concern to try and address what was called the male disadvantage agenda. There was a focus entirely on boys. There was emerging evidence of boy-orientated curriculum materials and an approach in some instances which was beginning to identify some boys as surrogate girls. In some classes, gay boys and gay girls were beginning to get a really rough time from their peers. And there was real unease in those schools as to how these boys and these girls were coping, particularly in a context of bullying. So, the Raising Boys Achievement Project, if you like. Very difficult for a man working with a team of feminists to be able to identify with the underachieving agenda in England. But I tried hard. I think in the work that we were developing, there are 4 points that I really must stress, summarized here. A growing awareness that this is a really complex issue. This issue about raising boys' achievement in a context of helping girls as well is really complex. We were keen not to support the poor boys discourse as it was becoming known. We wanted to react against short-term views that a boy is a boy is a boy, you know. You might look around the women here, look at the man who is next to you, you know. A man is a man is a man. How about diversity and variety, just as a woman is not a woman is not a woman? We wanted to acknowledge variety and diversity in this approach. And to recognize that gender really is a very difficult concept for us to address easily within any educational context. On the Raising Boys Achievement Project, over the period 2001 to 2005, therefore, we did an enormous amount of work with schools where good practice seemed to be being established in terms of single-sex teaching in mixed comprehensive schools. We focused on good practice. I think it's really important to stress this. This is by no means a typical picture of England. It is a picture of schools, of comprehensive secondary schools, where good practice is in place about single-sex teaching for boys and for girls. We interviewed hundreds of boys and girls over a 3-year period. We went back and we continually talked with these boys and girls. We talked with their teachers. We talked with the head teachers in the schools. We observed lessons and saw whether what the teachers said they did was actually what they did in practice. Teachers were exceedingly generous with their time and with their commitment to us. And these are some of the conclusions that emerged in terms of students' perspectives. I won't go through them all, but able to participate without peer pressure, for example, able to contribute without embarrassment, more confident. In all our schools, girls gave single-sex teaching unequivocal support. In all our schools, boys were a little more guarded. They thought that it was a good idea, but they didn't want it extended, because actually they liked working with girls, and in many schools they felt girls helped them with their learning. That's an interesting point. The student voices then, just to give a bit of substance to this. You don't have to worry about what you look like if boys aren't there. I'm not quite certain about this second quote from a 15-year-old boy. My hormones don't dance so much to the beat of the night. I think that means he's less distracted by what he perceives to be beautiful girls in the class with him. You don't need to act as though you're really cool, especially when you're not feeling like that. You feel braver and less embarrassed in offering answers. It gives you a lot more confidence to answer questions because there's not so much pressure and embarrassment if you are wrong as there would be with girls about. Now, in the language of students, those points, I think, are very important to us as educators to take on board and to try and address. At the same time, though, some real questions emerged. And questions emerged about management of classrooms. And usually, the concern was about teaching boys' classes. From whether the teachers were girls or were men or women. A concern with teaching and managing boys-only classes. But the point we want to make too is that girls' classes are not the ideal context that they're frequently made out to be. This second quotation, for example, it's high energy teaching when it's all girls together. They can be so bitchy towards each other. They don't forget or let go as easily as boys. And we have seen from our classroom observations male teachers, experienced male teachers, who have been absolutely crucified by classes of girls because they have totally misjudged the environment and the context. So there are some really difficult questions that we need to address about classroom management within that particular context. What we have got from this work, though, and remember it's work with good schools over 4 or 5 years, quite intensive work, is some issues about teaching pedagogy, some issues about how you teach such classes. Watching lessons, talking with teachers, talking with students. These seem to be the quality of effective pedagogy in these schools in England within the context of single-sex classes. And a pedagogy which is also linked with attitude. One of the presenters yesterday was talking about the crucial importance of teacher attitude, of teacher response to students. And we felt that what emerged from these studies was a crucial nature of a team of teachers needing to work together, prepared to take risks, prepared to acknowledge that there would be some failures, working within tight short-term targets, but also accepting humour, accepting informality of response, identifying with students, teachers who were prepared not to take themselves too seriously. Teachers who were prepared occasionally to acknowledge that a 14 or 15-year-old group of students might know something slightly more than they did about particular perspectives of modern living, for example, and try to work with that. Our work suggested that pedagogy in single-sex classes was not at all straightforward. That it wasn't simply a matter of implementing a series of practices, but trying to contextualize these, trying to form these within a set of beliefs and attitudes and expectations, articulated within the ethos of the school, and in a way where the students identified and recognized what the teachers were actually trying to do. Interviewing teachers, they talked about the need to generate a sense of self-belief amongst students, to recognize and acknowledge achievements in different activities, in drama, in sport, in dance, in community work, all of which tends to be very peripheral in English secondary schools, and to engage positively with students. A quotation at the bottom there by a female teacher of modern languages in one of the schools about the humour, the smiling informality of tone, the willingness to banter and to chat informally. That might be second nature here, but it's certainly not second nature in many English secondary schools. The research outcomes then can be summarised, I think, fairly straightforward. We resist the notion that there is such a thing as a boy-friendly pedagogy or a girl-friendly pedagogy. This is a notion which is held by some of our colleagues in different parts of England. But actually from our work, from the work that Molly and I have done over 5-10 years, when you actually examine what boy-friendly pedagogy is, it's actually simply good teaching. If you examine what girl-friendly pedagogy is, it's simply, and I use that word simply, knowing how difficult it is, good teaching. Teaching that's characterised by pace and by purpose, by a strong teacher presence and high expectations. And so we put our face, we resist the notion about there being a gendered pedagogy with different teaching styles for girls and boys necessarily. There may be some contexts where it's appropriate, but not always. And we certainly resist the idea that there's a differentiated curriculum. In some schools, we found that the girls were studying romantic poetry and the boys war poetry. In some schools, we discovered that the girls were studying Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, as you might imagine. The boys were studying the cut and thrust of Julius Caesar in terms of Shakespeare. We resist that totally, but we think it's much more to do with teacher style. So, drawing this all together and aware of the time, we've tried to identify sets of preconditions that we think are important from this experience. What we did was to try and identify schools where it was working well, single-sex teaching in mixed comprehensive schools, and then to try, with the cooperation of teachers, to translate those strategies elsewhere into other schools, and to see if those strategies could be sustained. From that experience, which was very salutary, because we got some remarkable successes and some abysmal failures, yes? And in one school, the girls' achievement shot through the roof, but the boys' achievement only increased gradually. So the gender gap between girls' and boys' achievement increased, despite the fact that both girls and boys had improved. So the head discontinued the experiment. So we've got some abysmal failures as well as real successes. But these are the sorts of preconditions. This doesn't work in a week. Teachers need time to think it through appropriately. It needs a real commitment amongst teachers, a willingness to establish a culture in which teachers can exchange experiences without risk of failure, without risk of being undermined. And particularly what we've called proactive senior leadership. Where this really worked, the head teacher, the principal, the rector really identified with the strategy and really worked to support the teachers. Where it worked less effectively, the head teacher would say to groups of teachers, okay, try it, see how it goes, but didn't really identify proactively with it. And that is crucial. and also explaining and rationalizing the initiative to the whole school community. I've talked about these other preconditions already, I think. The second point is important. In England, where underperforming boys and underperforming girls have improved, the school has helped them to work without undermining their image as an individual, without undermining their image as a bolshy child, if you like, a rebellious child. The school has brought together support and demand in helping to reconcile the image and to enable the children to develop their self-image as normal teenagers, whilst at the same time acknowledging that it is valid, it is okay for them to work and to achieve. I said earlier that there were some cautionary words, and inevitably I ought to stress that this is no panacea. This is no automatic success solution. And we've tried to define there cautionary words for head teachers. Head teachers in England are very keen on single-sex teaching. It appears to be something they can get hold of. They can understand it. They can promote it to their communities. We spend a lot of time saying to heads, yes, please go ahead, but remember, there is an equal chance that it will have very little impact. And these are the sorts of challenges that we suggest the head teachers have to face. Particularly trying to reconcile this point about a boy and a girl. What is a boy? What is a girl? You know, the notion that we can talk about boys' underachievement or girls' overachievement, as some of our schools do, and for it to be meaningful at all, we need to get beyond all these generalizations and to ensure there's a sufficient body of teachers to actually carry it through. So a final slide. I was introducing new students to the Faculty of Education the other day, and at the end one student came up to me and said, that was a brilliant session, but you do realise you said, so the final slide 4 times, don't you? But anyway, this is really the final slide. And to try and conclude, in our view, single-sex teaching is not a universal panacea, is not a universal success solution. In some schools, there has been really positive impact upon achievement of pupils in mathematics, in science, in English, and in a modern foreign language. And the fact that I'm doing this in English should actually tell you, if you don't already know, that if you can get boys in England learning a modern foreign language well, then you've really succeeded. That's your success criteria. Positive impacts upon achievement for both boys and girls, but not in all schools. So in some instances, the gender gap hasn't necessarily been narrowed because both girls and boys have continued to achieve. It needs time. This cannot work in a term. It cannot work in a school year. If you're a head teacher, if you're a rector sitting here, it needs at least 18 months to come to fruition, we would argue. It needs the development of a group of intervention strategies which recognise that gender is a very diverse and fluid concept and that we need to reach out to other boys, to other girls, to boys and girls who define their sexuality differently, who define their interests differently, as well as to the mass that we see in front of us. And teachers are committed to carrying those initiatives through into the future. And that's the best success criteria we can think of. Thank you for listening so patiently. I hope you've followed the gist of what I've said, and I can only apologise that I've had to deliver it in English. Thank you.